Laura Louise, thanks very much for having me tell some stories. The first one, she wanted me to sort of break the ice with a little bit of a funnier story. This story's not funny. I do work in the territory of Nunavut. Nunavut is Canada's newest territory. It's been around since 1999. It's twice the size of Texas. If it was a country on its own, it would be the 10th largest country in the world. It has a population of 30,000 people, about the population of Woodstock, Ontario. And those 30,000 souls live in 27 communities scattered about the territory of about 1,000 people each. Bringing justice services to them is a huge challenge. Access to justice in those communities has a whole different meaning. Government services, healthcare, education suffer the same issues of distance and resources and people. It's a very difficult place to service. And I've had the privilege of visiting up there 35 times and visiting 15 of those communities on a court circuit where we fly in and do a bunch of cases and we all become friends and try to leave the community with some sense of justice. It's a real struggle to do that for many reasons. The territory has 10 times the national average of violent crime, 10 times the national average of sexual assault, 10 times the national average of suicide. They actually have a preteen suicide statistic, which is quite heartbreaking. And I don't know if you noticed Gord Downie at his last concert mentioned, it's not cool what's going on up there. And he was very subtle about it, but very poignant and very, very, very honest about it. And he's right. I've had those circuits, and I really enjoy doing them. The way I got up there in the first place was not a circuit, it was a trial. And I'm going to tell you that story if I can. On the night of January 6, 2007, 4 men and one woman went to the tiny bungalow of a 21-year-old named Chris Bishop. They were drunk, high, and angry at him for a variety of minor beefs. And Chris called the police. And he spoke to a dispatcher named Louise. And by the time he was talking to Louise, all he could really say to her was, well, actually, they're running away. And she said, well, call back if there's any problems. 5 minutes later, he called back and calmly said, they're coming back with more people. Now, he was wrong about that. It was just 5 of them. But Louise put him on hold to call an officer named Robert and say, we need police assistance at Chris's house. She goes back to Chris after 30 seconds, and this is what you hear. You hear screaming and banging on the door, and Chris is panicking now. They're coming. They're trying to get in my house. Send someone over quick. And she assures him the police are on their way. And the call is terminated. What Chris didn't tell Louise was that on his lap was an SKS-10 semi-automatic rifle with a 30-round clip. He was in his bedroom. The attackers did get in and came to his bedroom with weapons in their hands and anger on their faces, and Chris started shooting. The biggest and oldest of the gang coming in, his name was Keith, and Keith had his stomach contents and intestines splattered on the bedroom wall, but he wasn't fatally injured yet, and he and the rest of them all ran out of the house, and Chris followed. And Chris kept shooting, and they were all hit. A man was slumped over the threshold of the house. His name was Dean. He was the lone white man there. He had 3 bullets in his head. Keith died at the bottom of the porch stairs. 2 other people named Logan and Antoinette took bullets in their triceps and survived. The last man to die, his name was Kevin, and he was 40 yards away when he was fatally shot. And the pathologist and eyewitnesses strongly suggested that Kevin was crawling when the fatal shot was fired. Townspeople rushed to Chris, and one of them took the gun off him, and a woman found Keith, and it was her nephew, and realized he was dead. And she ran to the home of the staff sergeant. His name was Louis Jeanvin, a very affable, very warm and friendly and responsible professional police officer. He was in bed in his pajamas, and she banged on his door. "Louis!" she called out, and he woke up and came down. She told him there had been this shooting. He got dressed and walked with her back to the scene. No other police officer arrived for 10 more minutes. That officer on the phone with Chris had claimed he was coming all along. Access to justice indeed. He arrived by truck, and Cambridge Bay, the town this happened in, is half a mile across. Chris was arrested and charged with murder. He was a 21-year-old son of a white man and an Inuk woman, and he'd grown up in Iqaluit and had spent most of his life growing up in Iqaluit and Yellowknife. And he was in Cambridge Bay, this small town on Victoria Island, a town of 1,300 people in the Arctic Ocean. He was there as an apprentice lineman. Every Nunavut community gets its power by burning diesel fuel in generators, and it takes a lot of maintenance. And he was there working. He'd been there for about 6 months. Was a bit of an outsider, didn't have any friends. Liked to hunt and loved the outdoors. Chris was held in custody, and for 2 years couldn't find a lawyer. Nunavut, being a very young territory, only had a few criminal lawyers. A few of them were conflicted from the case because they'd represented the deceased. I'll tell you more about that later, about the deceased's backgrounds. One of them was appointed a judge, and one lawyer, we're not really sure who, but told the newspaper that Chris should just plead guilty and get it over with, first-degree murder. Chris, after 2 years, had to go to court pretty much by himself and say, I need a lawyer. And the Nunavut Legal Services Board actually intervened in it and said, no, you have to use one of our lawyers, and we don't have any. And the judge obviously saw the conundrum here and granted outside counsel to Chris. And he hired a man from Toronto named Calvin Martin, an older man who had experience in firearms cases. And he did the preliminary hearing and was representing Chris. And Chris had himself a lawyer 2.5 years into it now, still in custody. And 5 months before his trial date, Calvin Martin died of a stroke. And there was no one to do the case. Chris was going to be in custody for 3.5 years before his trial was going to start. He didn't want an adjournment. Not a lot of lawyers out there can pick up a case on 5 months' notice, let alone a triple homicide. And Chris was frustrated and phoning around and got on the phone with and managed to call Eddie Greenspan. And through a few other permutations and twists and turns, the case ended up coming to me. I was in the process of moving my practice from Toronto to Goderich, so I actually had really not that much on my plate at the time. I was winding down, and I could accommodate the case 5 months' notice. Now, the case itself actually was quite a focused trial. It didn't need to take 3.5 years to come to court. It wasn't a complicated matter, really. No one was denying that Chris was the shooter, and everyone agreed that these 5 were the ones who brought the confrontation to his house. But of course, most of them were shot once already having left the house, running away, and Kevin was shot 40 yards away in circumstances that seemed like he was trying to get away. It was a difficult case for the defense, for sure. But here was the thing. The prosecution was trying to say that Chris was just picking off townspeople sort of randomly and with some cold calculation, and that just wasn't true. 60 seconds after Chris hung up that second phone call, a neighbor across the street was talking to Louise, having a conversation with her, where he said, I can see bloody bodies in the street. And when you properly understand those 60 seconds, in order to realize the actual time it took, you have to realize you have to subtract from that the time it took to get the door opened by the intruders, go down the hall of his house, into his bedroom, and the time for this man, whose name was Jeffrey, to look out his window and make sense of what he was seeing through the darkness. It's 3 in the morning in the Arctic. And go to the phone and dial and be connected and start talking. I think the case took about 30 seconds from the time they got that door open till the time everybody was on the ground. Chris fired 25 bullets in those 30 seconds. I defended him on the basis this was one unbroken fury. The deceased were all told in the police brief. The police brief said that the deceased were all unarmed. That's what the initial police report said. Nunavut has no forensic pathology unit, so the deceased were all flown after spending 3 days on the street in frozen snow because homicide detectives couldn't land because of a blizzard. Sometimes justice can't access. And so 3 days in the snow, they're flown to Toronto. They went to Grosvenor Street, right over here, Toronto's chief coroner. A lot of Nunavut services are given by provinces nearby, depending on what part of the territory they're going to, because they don't have all the services. So in Toronto, they discovered that Kevin actually had a golf club frozen in his hand, missed by homicide detectives when they were investigating. It was broken, and then if you looked at the pictures of the scene, the head of it was on Chris's front porch. Missed by homicide. Did they jump to conclusions here? I always thought they did, and I often suspected, based on other eyewitness accounts, that the surviving two members of this group had actually removed evidence from the scene. The deceased also had criminal records. Now, they weren't just criminal records, they were criminal records for violent home invasions, threatening people and police with weapons. And I wanted to tender this for the limited purpose of showing this was not just mischievous punks, as the Crown was trying to portray them to be. Just drunks causing trouble. They were just yelling. No, they were a violent group. The judge was a man named John Vertus, a very fair and very conscientious judge, but he disagreed with me. He said, Mr. Cowan, everyone knows they're the intruders. No one's denying that. Why are you piling on? Why are you trying to malign these dead people with this record? It's not necessary. It doesn't help your case. I went to the jury at the end of the case saying, what murderer calls the police twice before they do this deed? And the Crown went to the jury saying, oh, they were just a nuisance. He should have just put a chair in front of the door. Chris was found guilty of 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder and sentenced to 3 life terms. I commiserated with myself by taking some red wine and Radiohead to the cottage for a couple of days. And Chris went to Kingston Penitentiary, thousands of miles from his family and millions of miles from his culture. Now, in the time this happened, this whole lawyer business, trying to get him a lawyer, Nunavut actually developed a counsel of choice panel and an access and a transparent system for getting accused people lawyers. And Chris got a very good appeal lawyer named James Morton from here in Toronto. And James appealed that very decision that I'd lost on. And the case actually went to the Supreme Court of Canada briefly. The Nunavut Court of Appeals decision actually won the day. And they overturned the conviction. And Chris was given a new trial. The court was not impressed with the Crown trying to downplay the intensity of the attackers and felt that the trial had become unbalanced by not letting the defense put in the antecedents of the deceased. Just this year, James, with the help of James, Chris resolved the case by pleading guilty to manslaughter, and he was released earlier this year. And he's now trying to rebuild his life with his family and his love of the outdoors. A just result, in my view, I'd actually argue to the jury there were elements of the case that cried out for a manslaughter conviction. And Nunavut, just last month, was assessed, all of Canada was. So there's a study of justice systems by a think tank in Ottawa called MacDonald Laurier, and they assessed the justice systems of all the provinces, and Nunavut got a C+. But for access to justice and fairness on the defense bar, they got an A+. And Nunavut now has, it has for some time, but now has 3 law offices staffed by mostly young, very vigorous and very conscientious lawyers. And they have a transparent counsel of choice panel now for serious criminal cases. And I think some of that was due to Chris's case and his long, long road to justice. So thanks very much for listening to me, and please support measures you hear about to support the Arctic and improve the situation up there. It does deserve our attention. It's a remarkable place. Thanks very much for your attention tonight, folks.